So at this point, we have Indi Young and Brian Sullivan coming to you from the United States. Indi is in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's the author of Mental Models. She's a legend. And Brian, who I confess I didn't know before I reached out to his Dallas group. I'm sorry, Brian. You can scold me later. Brian is also joining for an Ask Me Anything session. So this is really going to be a chance here for you, the audience. So currently you're about 800. It'll probably go up during the session. And you'll be able to, I know, for shame, right? I should know Brian. But I've met him now in the past 2 weeks, and he's been extremely helpful getting this whole thing set up. So if Indi and Brian would like to join, it's going to be an Ask Me Anything session. I think they have some thematics that they'll want to talk about between themselves to share with you. But then the idea is that you send questions in on the chat, and they'll try to pick them up as best they can. I'll be here in the background trying to help out as well. So without further ado, I hope that Indi and Brian could kindly join the stage. There's Brian. Great. Are you there yet? Hi. Can't hear you yet, Brian, so we need
How about now?
audio. Okay, there you are.
Sorry.
Well, Brian's coming to us from Dallas, Texas, where I'm sure it's much warmer than it is here in Geneva, which has been, we've had unseasonably cold weather for the past week. That's why I'm wearing a sweater.
It's actually pretty cool today. It's not, it's not 90 yet. Right. Yeah.
So, Brian has won a lot of awards. He's also got a book out. Brian, you can tell people about your background while we wait for Indi to come online.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So my name is Brian Sullivan, and I've written a book called The Design Studio Method, and it actually kind of works really well with Design Sprint. Mm-hmm. So as you heard Jake talking in the last session, he was talking about design sprints are really good for certain types of problems. Sometimes you just need to create and kind of knock out a design and brainstorm some solutions. And that's what the Design Studio Method tries to do. It tries to optimize and accelerate collaboration with people. Besides authoring the book, I am a college professor at Southern Methodist University. Jay Hsu, Preston McCulley, and I created a certificate program there, and that is an award-winning program. It's been going on for about 5 years. Some of my students are probably on the line, actually. So there's Indi.
There you are. You did it.
I had to scramble and look at your instructions again.
Yeah. Congratulations. There
Sorry.
You are. No problem at all. Welcome.
Yay! Sorry, Brian, to interrupt. Go ahead.
No. Just a little bit of background on me. So I've written a book, college professor, and then I'm also a director of design strategy at Sabre, which is the really big travel company, and I've been doing that for a long time. I moved in from doing traditional usability, user research, did that for 15 years. In the last 5 years, I moved into a strategy role. My team and I have traveled pretty much all over the world doing design thinking workshops, design sprints, and educating people. And that's me.
Thank you, Brian. Indi, just maybe take a couple minutes to introduce yourself to the world.
Yay. Hi, world. I love you all. I'm so excited to be here. I think it's super exciting times to feel more in touch with our community around the world. And I'm offering a lot of help to people in other countries because you guys are just as good as we are in these countries. So have at it. I've written a couple of books. The last one was Practical Empathy. Next one's going to be about thinking styles. And my whole approach is to try to get people to take more time understanding the people that they're trying to support. And I use my language very carefully. And so maybe Brian and I will be able to talk a little bit about that. You may have run across me. I've got a bunch of courses that I teach online live globally. And I've started meeting a lot of people that way, which is really fun. All right.
I think it's just you and I.
I think it is. Let's take it away.
Okay. So I did purchase Practical Empathy, and just thank you for that book. Very, very, very well done. Very beautiful. One of the things that I found interesting in your book is about the power of listening. Mm-hmm. And would you just share maybe some thoughts that you had around listening? Maybe, as you were writing the book, and it's been a little while now since it's been published, but about the power of listening and what you learned from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all, in this field, at least, we understand that listening is really powerful. When I was writing that book, what I was trying to do was understand the actual mechanics of listening and what's going on. So as I was doing research for it, and also working with, taking experience from my own work, I started to realize that listening is something that isn't taught. We are taught reading, and we're taught, how to write, but we're not taught how to speak or how to listen. And there are actual elements to it. So what I try to do is simplify it and say, listen, you're either listening to someone speak, or you are hearing your own thoughts and reactions in response to that person. That's generally the easiest entry point to this idea of listening, where the other half of it that I say to make it really importantly a part of your life is that listening is very difficult. It is not something you can do 100% of the time. You are a human. You need your own space. You're going to have reactions, and you need to have time to deal with those. So listening and doing empathic listening specifically is a very heavy hat to wear. And you have to sort of, you can put it on. You're like, wow, this is really heavy. And I can listen for about 60 seconds, and then I have to take it off again. That's fine, because as you put it back on another day, you can listen a little bit longer, and eventually you can work your way up. Your neck muscles will get stronger, right? You'll start to understand the parts of what people are saying, whether they're speaking at surface, which is all about opinions and explanations, how things are working, all about preferences and statements of fact and that sort of thing. Or if you can entice them into speaking about their actual inner thinking. So that's depth, inner thinking, the actual thoughts that are flying through your head as you're trying to accomplish a purpose, your reactions as you're trying to accomplish that purpose, how you deal with those reactions, the decisions you make, and the guiding principles that are guiding those decisions. So those three things, the inner thinking, the reactions, and the guiding principles, are what make up cognitive empathy. That's actually the definition, being able to think that way, to see how that other person is thinking at depth. So one of the first things that I teach people in listening is it's hard. You can't do it for very long at first. And it's about stopping your own thoughts and trying to follow the other person's thoughts, and then trying to get to depth, trying to encourage that person to get to depth. There's actually a definition of something called empathic listening, which I can go into, but I've already talked too much already. So,
oh no, you've been great. One of the things that I've enjoyed with your LinkedIn posts is that you have talked about different types of empathy, and I think it's really important. I call it knowing the nuance. So when I teach at college, I try to make sure that my students understand that there are, different levels. Could you maybe spend a few minutes just maybe talking over some of the different levels of empathy? You started to do that, and you're speaking just fine. Keep it up.
Okay. I don't want to dominate this thing, and I'm looking like, let's get some questions. Anyway, yeah. So empathy. I just saw somebody else saying, "Oh, empathy can't be taught." Right? That's a great way to go into this. It's like, empathy can't be taught. And then other people are like, yes, empathy can be taught. And then the question is, well, what empathy are you talking about? There's actually, if you go into the psychology academic literature, there's like 12 different types of empathy. They don't argue about which one is the right one. There are 12 different types. There are 3 types that are fairly active in our discipline. And those 3 types are emotional contagion, empathic listening, and cognitive empathy, which I mentioned just a little bit earlier. So emotional contagion is, like it sounds, kind of causing, like either catching an emotion from someone else, from their experience, all the protests that are going on around the world about Black Lives Matter right now. We are catching emotional contagion. If this hasn't happened to us ourselves, I'm white, you're white, we're very privileged. We have not, we've each experienced some downfalls so we can get it, but we haven't experienced that. So what we're doing is we're catching emotional contagion. You can cause emotional contagion as well. That's what marketing people do. That's what the politicians do. They're trying to cause people to have an emotional reaction or to stay in surface, to stay at opinions and preferences, as opposed to start doing some inner thinking, some contemplation about concepts. And so, that's how marketing people get you to buy things you didn't intend to buy, or stay on Facebook longer than you intended to. So the other one, though, cognitive empathy, I described before, is knowing the inner thinking, reactions, and guiding principles of another person. So that third one that I use is called empathic listening. And it is frequently, when I hear other experts and academics talking about empathy, they frequently use empathic listening as their definition of empathy. So Dr. Brené Brown, she studies shame and vulnerability. In one of her talks, she described it, and it got animated. And I can show you a picture of that animation if we want to. But the definition is basically 4 things. So this is a live interaction you're having with somebody, whether you're with them physically or with them remotely like we are. You're noticing something's going on for them. They're maybe hesitating, or like trying to describe something, or having a little bit of an emotional reaction, or a bit of a freak out or something. It can be a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be an emotion. It's just something's going on for them and you notice. Okay. That's hard for some people. So we have to train ourselves to notice this. As you notice this, you may judge it. You may say, well, you shouldn't feel that way, or you shouldn't have to think about this because it's an easy decision, right? And that's the point at which, in the second step, we stop ourselves. We stop ourselves from judging, and we recognize that what's going on for that person is real for them. They have had decades of experience. Maybe if we're talking about a kid, it's not quite decades, but they have experience, which has led to all the thinking that's currently going on in their brain. All the synapses are firing for reasons of experience and learning. Okay. And it's valid. The emotions they're having are valid. So that's all step number 2 is to catch yourself from judging them and say, oh yeah, what's going on for them is fine. And then the third step is to tell them that you think what's going on for them is fine. And that is a way of inviting them to tell you more about it. Okay, so you're setting yourself up as a potential listener. They may not accept your invitation. That may have to be put off for later, or maybe it's a stranger and they just don't want to interact with you. I do all these little practices all the time when I'm out in public. I haven't been able to do it as much these days, but I still meet people when I'm out walking and we still have talks. So the fourth part of it is to let that person talk and listen and see if they're talking at surface or depth. And then what I do is I try to help them get to the depth, get to that inner thinking, those reactions, explain what those are, and explain what their guiding principles are.
So one of the things that I talk about a little bit in my classes is compassionate empathy. Mm-hmm. And I tend to see things, I don't know if I would call them empathic layers, but these different levels of empathy, and they're all interconnected and they're happening sometimes in a split second. Mm-hmm. And I see emotional contagion happening, right? And so we're drawn emotionally to something. And then, our world sometimes is impacted. And so we have to process that. We need to think about it. And that to me is cognitive empathy. And then if we get so compelled that we need to do something, that to me is a manifestation of compassionate empathy. It's not think, feel, act. It's feel, think, and then act. And I'm reminded of the quote, it's not what people say or do, but it's how you make them feel. And what I liked about your book is you really talked a lot about feelings. And one of the questions that we have in the chat is about getting to some of those emotional drivers. And the question's a little farther back, but it's talking about fear and anger. And I was wondering if you wanted to make some comments on that. I'll see if I can't pull up the actual comment. It's a little bit back.
Okay.
Fear and anger.
Yeah. So the way that I go about this is at 2 different levels, and the level that they may be asking about is not. So here's the 2 levels. I do it with respect to researching people who my organization will potentially want to support. So this is called problem-based research. It's not about the solution. It's not about a user who has a relationship to the org. It's about a person who has a purpose. So I do it there. And anger does come up. I also do this with respect to teams. Imagine, if you will, an interaction you may have had with somebody. Maybe you're a designer and it's a product manager who went off and tried doing a design on their own and said, just implement this. So you have a little anger there. So the other thing that they may be asking about is like in family relationships or with strangers. That is not my area of expertise, but there's someone who's named Edwin Ruch who is doing something that he calls the empathy tent, which he takes around to all the protests. No matter what kind of protest it is, he gets a bunch of volunteers who are good listeners, who know how to listen, know the mechanics of listening. They put on T-shirts that says, we listen, and then in this empathy booth, they get people coming up and have a chance to actually talk about what their inner thoughts are. So the feeling that I'm really after, and that Edwin is really after, is allowing someone to feel heard. So his process is, as you are listening to someone, you ask that person, do you feel heard? And keep going until that person feels heard. And I think that's the most beautiful gift you can give someone. This is so going back to where I use it is in like with teams. Part of the thing that I teach people to do is, like, if some incident has happened and you were not part of it, you watched it occur, you could say to each of these people separately, one-on-one, by the way, listening happens one-on-one. You can't do it in a group. You can say to one of them, hey, I see that you didn't feel heard, or it seems like you weren't heard, and give them a chance to talk, give them a chance and to get deep, get into that depth, get into their inner thinking. And that is a great gift. Being able to also begin your relationship building with the people that you work with and those other teams by doing listening sessions with them over and over. As time goes on, you start to build trust, and then you start knowing what each other's guiding principles are, and you can begin discussions with the guiding principles instead of the anger. Right? It takes a while though.
Yeah, and I think one of the sessions earlier today, I believe it was in Malaysia, they were talking about the importance of building bridges, especially with stakeholders. And I think something that's often overlooked is stakeholder empathy. Mm-hmm. And, you hear the term, put yourself in another person's shoes, which you talk about in your book. I actually really like the way that you talk about it. I think one of the things that people often forget, before you can wear another person's shoes, you have to take your own shoes off.
Right.
And I think that's a really hard thing to do, is to take your own shoes off. Do you have any tips and tricks on how to do that?
Yeah. I actually, with respect to that, I go back one step further. Everybody wants to walk in somebody else's shoes. Half the time they'll say, if I were, which is the wrong phrase to start. Or they say the word should. And the word should is a verb, a verboten verb. Okay, I can say another language, and this is global, right? Yeah. So we don't use that word. Should. The thing that I recognize, though, and I want to put a lot of emphasis on it, is that in our discipline, we are forced to go faster than we should. Move fast and break things, that works for engineering maybe, but it doesn't work for understanding people. So as professionals, I'm asking all of us to step up and push back and say, hey, we cannot walk in somebody else's shoes until we develop empathy for those other people. Otherwise, we're just doing it based on our make-believe imagination, based on one or two things we read. Based on one person's experience on the team, that's fantastic. We've got a team maybe that's slightly diverse, but it does not represent the perspectives of the people that you're trying to support. So the key is, let's take time. Let's push back. Let's take time. Let's actually understand those other perspectives out there. And then when it comes time for us to be in their shoes, I use something called thinking styles. So it's a type of an archetype. I just put a label on it so that we could have something to hold it by. It came out of my frustration with the way a lot of companies were developing and using personas, but it can play the same role. It helps you take off your shoes. It helps you say, oh, you know what? In this context, I'm this thinking style. Let me give you some examples because it's kind of hard to grasp. A thinking style that I did for an airline. So these were people who wanted to get from point A to point B. Most of the time, they ended up being passengers on an airline. And we discovered, we did 100 different listening sessions over the course of, I think it was about 16 months. We did 8 different studies. And what we found were 4 different thinking styles. And the thinking styles are things that you can switch between depending on the context. So one thinking style was engaged. I love travel. I love the mechanics of travel, meeting people, seeing new places, how the plane works, that sort of thing. You can imagine that if you are bringing your toddler on a trip to Disneyland, you might fall into that mindset because you want to give that toddler some excitement about the actual trip itself, right? There's another mindset that's called the just get me there. And the just get me there are like, this is a bus in the air. I've got places to be. I need to be there on time. I've organized this so that I've got enough leeway. I'm maybe going to get stuff done while I'm there. And that would maybe be you if you were like on your way to a wedding, or, you have to finish sewing your dress that you were going to wear on the wedding as a member of the group or something.
I'll be honest, that's totally me.
Exactly.
Just get me there. Just get me there.
Just get me there. It's not always you, though. There's another one that's called the unfazed. The unfazed are people who are, you're in a mindset where you're like, okay, I've got everything figured out. This is going to take all day. I have everything that I need. I'm just going to relax. If we get delayed, the airline's going to take care of us, right? I've got things that I can get done, or I've got the food that I need, or I've got things to keep my kids entertained. Right. It's all good. It's all good. And turned out most of the people working on the airline, they were either unfazed or engaged. The fourth one, though, is called the frustrated. And the frustrated is somebody who's like, this is not going the way I planned. There was this one woman who was coming home from a psychology conference in time to go to her 5-year-old's first piano recital. So, it's not going to be like this fabulous musical thing, but it's her child's first piano recital. So I gave myself 4 hours from landing to there. So for sure I was going to be able to make it, and they got delayed. And she became frustrated. The gate agents weren't treating her with respect. She wasn't getting information. There was a crowd. There was no way to figure out if there was still a chance of getting there. Where if you had understood her as a frustrated, you could have treated her differently. Like, oh, hey, here's there's a place where you can get good reception. You can have somebody FaceTime you in or something. So the interesting thing was that the team dissed the frustrated. They wanted to call them the grumblers. And worse, they wanted to say, well, they're grumbly in all aspects of their lives. These are probably the people who yell at you in traffic, right? Or honk their horn. And I'm like, whoa, no. This is just a context and a mindset that you're in that context. And so it's not a horoscope like so many personas show up to be. So that's an example of what thinking styles are. And that's how I help people take off their shoes and try to get into the mind of the other kind of people so that you can respect them, because they got there. Their emotions are valid. They got there from all this experience and all this thinking. They're not doing something ridiculous. And so to be able to have respect for a frustrated when you were on an airline team that thought they were just grumblers, that's a big switch.
There's a question in the chat from Darby. It's back a little ways, but it's, how does what's happening now with Black Lives Matter and the protests affect the work that you do? And then there's in parentheses, there's other minorities that have been directly impacted by police brutality. And also, she talks about people with disabilities too. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So one of the things that, and I gave a talk just last week where I was trying to be really explicit in the very beginning about the fact that Black Lives Matter, not only with respect to police brutality, but with respect to the algorithms, with respect to the interfaces, with respect to the services that we've allowed to be designed because we've allowed ourselves to be pushed into this speed. Okay, so this is why, so in that talk, I gave 4 things that I pledge. The first one is we've got to do it right. We've got to get the right method. We've got to get the right intent. We've got to get people interested in people, not interested in, well, hey, you know, could you give me some feedback on these designs, right? We're still thinking from the solution point of view. And the second thing is to deepen your understanding of people by doing listening sessions. Okay. This is only within my own little, what I can affect, right, within my discipline, with respect to the fact that, for example, the Algorithmic Justice League, Joy Boal-Amini, just yesterday testified at the Boston City Hall. I think they were having this big thing about turning off facial recognition. And facial recognition, I think yesterday was a big theme because it does not recognize faces very well with dark skin, because it was taught machine learning with pictures of white people. This goes for other ethnicities, other colors of skin, even shapes of face. She also did a talk about how facial recognition doesn't work very well for a woman's face or a young person's face, or a face that's maybe had something, you know, something's going on for that person. And so all of a sudden they become a red flag instead of a human being. So that's just one example. Sarah Wachter-Bocher wrote Technically Wrong, which is a great book. Kenneth Bowles wrote Future Ethics, which is also a great book. There's a bunch of writing out there about it. But anyway, those were two of the things that I pledged. The other one is to seek that bias and discrimination. And I'm just now about to deliver, why I couldn't give a talk today and prepare. I'm about to deliver a set of research where discrimination happened to over half of the participants. And so what we're doing is we're making our thinking styles. Thinking styles are actually demographic free, because demographics don't cause thinking except in cases of discrimination, except in cases of physiology. So I did a study once where with some people in wheelchairs, and physiology is what's causing thinking. Like one person was like, she's trying to get on the bus and there's no curb cuts at the bus. So she's like, wait, which century are we in? This is causing thinking. Also, environment and culture can also affect causing thinking. So that's when I add lenses back in to the thinking styles to emphasize that this is going on and we need to pay attention to it and we need to support it. We need, well, not like and make it happen more. We need to change it. Change is the better word. So the fourth thing that I just say in that pledge that I'm doing is slow down and take time. Time is our friend. And
I think yeah, that's really key, because when you look at like lean and agile and scrum and sprint,
yeah,
everything is so fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing that tends to get cut out is empathy. Mm-hmm. And to me, what I teach in my class religiously is that it's empathy leads to innovation, mm-hmm, and it should all be grounded in that. And if you don't empathize with someone, we talk about emotional design, right? Mm-hmm. If we don't understand the person's inner states, how can we design for someone? And how can we create something that is meaningful, that will change behavior? Yeah. And so that's something that in my classes I teach. There is an interesting question that, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how to answer, and I hope you do. And it's pretty simple. It's from Blanca. It's very short. How do you teach empathy to kids?
To kids. Deborah Gelman wrote a book which talks about design for kids. I don't work with kids. I am not qualified to answer that question. I think that the way that I teach it to adults is not to teach it by the word empathy, because there are so many types of empathy. But I'm very careful with my words. I'm going to teach people how to listen deeply. That's empathic listening. And if you do that enough, with a person. So if you demonstrate it to your child by listening to them, by saying, hey, I recognize something's going on for you. Hey, it's valid for you. I'm not going to tell you you shouldn't feel it or you should do something else. Hey, I hear you. I see this is valid and it's going on for you. Tell me more. Get that kid to see you acting that out. That child may be able. So in my experience with research, as you're growing up, you are measured by how well you can solve problems and come up with answers,
right.
Not measured by how well you can express your inner thinking. And so by giving your child that chance, and I am no expert in this, but I think by giving your child that chance early, often, as they're growing up, to learn how to express what their inner thinking is, that's going to make them into a much more aware adult.
Right.
And
validation is a very powerful thing across the board. And as you were just describing it, and I'm sorry that I cut you off, but
that's fine.
I was reminded of a moment in time, a memory where my son was struggling, and I go, use your words.
Right.
and then, boy, I couldn't get him to shut up. He was really just,
great.
He really used his words and tried to validate the feelings.
It's hard because as a parent, you're in a position of authority. And so anyone in any, even yourself, when you're in a position where there's somebody else in authority over you, you act differently, you say different things. So having that person who is in authority, and anyone who's listening who does have leadership, it's so important to say yes and all the time. Never no buts. It's more of an embracing, welcoming, I want to hear you, which gives that person maybe a little confidence to say what they actually meant. Or what's actually going through their mind. In a lot of situations, so I saw one of the questions is like, well, okay, how do you persuade? How do we persuade our stakeholders to slow down? And I hear that's a huge question, and I'm wanting to address that. I'm collecting data on it right now so that I don't talk out of thin air. So send me some stories about what you encounter yourself. Anyone who's out there who wants to, and I will make this a more formal participation later, but I'm just like so busy.
Right.
Yeah, but the idea is that I hear about so many toxic relationships between leadership and us, and our own reaction to it is to step away, to not participate. That is the wrong reaction. If we want to make a difference, we have to step forward and say, there's something going on and I want to hear about it. Now, I am in a relationship to you, which is, I'm not the authority, right? So maybe I need to have someone else do a listening session with you. One of the things that I was recommending was that if your relationship is not that toxic yet, start having a listening session with this person like once every other week. I was telling people, never eat lunch alone. Have listening sessions with people around you at work all the time. I think we can still do this remotely. We all still have to eat, right? But the idea is that relationship building and team building doesn't come for free. We can't go buy a box and open it up and there it is, it's delivered. We have to take time and show that we're interested in hearing what this person has to say. And eventually, after maybe the 5th listening session, they will start asking us the same questions, unless they're a narcissist. And I have no answer for that situation. But it takes work on our side. So I think that in answer to like, how do we persuade people to do it, is we step up, we step forward, we move into position so that we are using our tools and we're showing how to build trust And by building trust within our own teams, we are demonstrating, just like we're demonstrating for the child, we're demonstrating how to listen, and then we're demonstrating how this might work with respect to problem-based research, so that we can now start noticing where we're only supporting like the average user, which is a total myth. There's nobody who's average.
Right.
And start to actually support real people differently.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to share real quick is that I like to do these sessions with, I'll call them extreme users, not necessarily mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to really kind of stretch perspective a little bit, right? So when I'm doing my user research and in my college classes, I teach this. We need to look at the extremes, and sometimes the extremes, like again, if we take the example of travel, right?
Mm-hmm.
On, one extreme is the person that is super experienced, they're a road warrior, they're doing stuff all the time. And then on the other extreme might be a disabled person that only travels once every 3 years. And if I can get a really good understanding of those extremes, I've really just broadened my perspective. And if I can have sessions with enough of them, I feel like it's this concept of make the extreme mainstream. And if we can get that perspective and we can account for that, then we can make meaningful change. So I really like the fact that you had mentioned extremes, because for the people that are in my class tomorrow night on Thursday, that assignment is due. And I know that some of you are in the session right now.
Yeah. So with respect to that, I think the idea of I have this on my website. You can find the diagram. I have this diagram where I talk about the difference between problem space and solution space, and being very careful with the word user.
Yeah.
A lot of people, I call them customers, or I call them clients, or I call them patrons, or I call them passengers, or I call them whatever. Still, whatever noun you're replacing user with is in relationship to your organization. Mm-hmm. If someone in the solution space, what I use is the word person or human.
Right.
I don't use other words. Those words are handily translated to other languages. But the importance is that when I am saying, when I'm talking about someone who's in relationship to our org, and we're looking at them through the lens of the org, the solution, that's one thing. If we're looking at them through the lens of their purpose, what they're trying to get done, that's where I want more depth. And that's where I want more extremes. And to add to what you were saying, yes, and do it again and again and again. What I like to say is it's like exploring a new territory. We cannot explore the whole thing. The next team that comes after we retire will inherit what we know and keep exploring. We're going to explore every year. We're going to do a little bit more exploring. We're going to sketch out a little bit more. Maybe we wait 5 years, because there's a lot in what we just sketched out that we have not supported. There are a lot of gaps and weaknesses that we can go back in and make a way for somebody who is an unfazed traveler. Actually, I think most of it is unfazed. It supports the unfazed. Let's make a better way to support someone who is a frustrated traveler, and treat different thinking styles differently. Maybe sense. We need humans, perhaps machine learning eventually, to sense what mindset, what thinking style somebody's in at the moment, to be able to support them better with better directly created support for that situation, not average support. Right. And then as we keep going, and we do another study and another study and another study, and the next team that comes in after we retire, they do more studies. We're just sketching stuff out. We're making a big, we're exploring this area and sketching out what it looks like. And we're never going to know everything, which frustrates the hell out of the stakeholders. Mm-hmm. But I think that's if we look at it from the large perspective, the stakeholders are trying to uphold what the organization's goal is. And the organization's goal is, there are more and more organizations' goals who are to make a difference, to make a social difference, to uplift people. While we also can earn some money, but the key is to uplift people. However, there are still a lot of old corporations who have a hell of a lot of power. Oops, I'm saying too many swear words. They have to, I get excited about this. They have so much power and so much history that they're afraid to change. Yet the people who are in power, noticing and being members of society just like we are probably eager to see change.
Yeah. I think also when you think about stakeholders, a couple of thoughts come to mind. So first off, relationships relationships are a contact sport. So you can't fall back. You may have to lean in. You might have to do lunch, but it is a contact sport. Mm-hmm. And you do need to be able to listen to people, talk to people. And we mentioned earlier the importance of stakeholder empathy. One of the things that I've done, maybe to answer a question a little while back, is in some of my design thinking workshop and in some of my design sprints, one of the things that I make sure to do is to include the actual people that are using the product. And I'm asking the product managers or the people in charge to listen, to not try to talk over people, learn from them, right? And what I found to be interesting is that once they make that flip, if you will, that they almost can't get enough. The hard part, though, is to get them to make the flip. And that requires two things, in my humble opinion: trust and respect, and that's
humility.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of humility, absolutely. Yeah. And you know, I've had people that are very surprised at, I think, some of the most effective workshop facilitators are people that can work with just about anybody. They can work with people they don't like, don't trust, and don't respect, and they can still get something out of them. And I don't know how these people are able to do it. I'm able to do it from time to time. I don't have a lot of stamina like I used to, though. I usually end up having a partner with me to help me out, and then we kind of do a little dance. But do you have any like strategies that you use to like build trust and respect, show humility?
Yeah. So a lot of questions behind that, packed in there behind that.
Yeah.
Also, I think one of the things that's super important is that I don't use the word empathy very often. I use the word listening. Yeah. Listening is a far less contentious and full of argument sort of thing. Listening is very learnable. Listening is hard. You do get exhausted. You don't have the stamina, like you say. And your solution to it is grand. Have a partner, right? The other half of it, though, is that you're talking about workshops. And when I do listening, I always only do it one-on-one. So also packed behind here, there's a woman named Andrea Goulet who works on legacy code and talks a lot to developers. And she says, hey, we've got this thing where they've been told they're not good with people. They've been told that they're introverts, and so they can't do this. But when it's just the idea of listening, it turns out that a lot of them already have a lot of skill in listening. And when you talk about doing it one-on-one, when I do my listening sessions for client projects, right, to understand the people we're trying to support in the problem space, I do it by phone with no video. Because what I want to do is get as close to having telepathy with them as possible. There are a lot of reasons I write about in the book, the reasons why I do that. But I think mentioning those two things, may help people who feel like, well, I can't do this, or I've got people around me who are non-empathetic or not interested in empathy. If you stop talking about empathy and talk about listening and talk about the power of listening within our business of understanding the different ways that people think and the different thinking styles that people represent. I also create opportunity maps where I do a mental model diagram of all the patterns across. So I don't just look at streams. What I want to do is make sure that when I frame a study, I've got patterns that are going to come up out of it. And that's what makes it the top half of an opportunity map. But the idea is that if you've got in the other world where you're working with team members, what if you've got somebody who just doesn't want to play? Don't use the word empathy, use the word listening. If they still don't want to listen to them. Find out why. Where did that come from? That's got a history. There's a reason, and it's a totally valid reason. And it will help you to understand what that reason is. It will change your thinking. It'll change your relationship. So when I mentioned earlier about toxic relationships, I think so much of it is our own fault because we label it. We like classifying things and we label it as this thing and it doesn't get to change. And
have you ever heard the quote from Abraham Lincoln? So he was known as one of the best presidents in the United States, and he had what was called a cabinet of rivals. So they were not people that agreed with him. Mm-hmm. And he has a very famous saying that I don't agree with you. I should listen to you more.
Great. Yeah.
I thought was
I haven't heard that.
It was just absolutely powerful.
Yeah.
And to me, that I was reminded of that quote when you were talking about a stakeholder that isn't willing to listen, that they're being overly aggressive, and then, hey, maybe you should listen to them more. And I was reminded of the Abraham Lincoln quote.
Yeah, that's great.
I don't agree with you. I should probably listen to you more.
Yeah. That is great. That is super great. I love it. Very apropos. And scary as heck, but if you're not the person to do it, somebody on your team might be able to do it. Right? You might be allies with another person who's a peer at that same hierarchical level of that other person. There are, hierarchy itself and authority and relationships if it's misused, which in Western culture, it has definitely been taught as a thing to misuse. You own power. Yeah. Right? I've just been reading a lot of Ursula Le Guin books. I love this one. It's called Always Coming Home, about a mythical tribe of people where one of the things is that you can be powerful, but it is a mantle that you put on and that you take off after the meeting or whatever. And that's, I think, a very foreign concept to the Western culture, and probably a very common concept in other cultures. And that's the kind of thing that I want to, that I really want to encourage with this global ability for us to talk to each other. It's not a top-down thing. Right. We have a lot to learn, and we have a lot of new things that can influence us as we join together and try to make the world of creating products and services pay more attention to the people that it's trying to support and their purposes and their experiences.
Yeah, that's a very powerful thing. And I think we forget about it too, because back to, speed, we've got to speed through this. And sometimes we don't take a step back. I'm also reminded of, the Elements of User Experience book at the strategy level. The two things that are coming in conflict, right, are the business objectives, and then they call it user needs. You could call it people needs, but they're always crashing against one another. And there's this push and pull and tug of war between those things. And a lot of it is stakeholders get measured by certain metrics, and so they are motivated by that. I do think that everyone wants to be a problem solver. I think sometimes we can't agree on the problem that we want to solve, and that requires listening and empathy, and we tend to go over that, and we don't take the time to do that. And I think if I use the metaphor of like a rowboat, and we're all on the boat together, and if we can all agree on the destination, what that user need is, and we row, it's a lot smoother. If we don't agree on it, we're all just kind of like going in a circle, and we're not giving people what they really need.
Yeah.
Jesse.
Yeah, I'm jumping in here. I will carry that rowboat analogy further. And at some point, I will dig up the image that this guy did on an Agile project. Literally, he drew the members of the team on a boat.
Wow. Nice.
It's incredible.
Nice.
And you can see how dysfunctional it can be. And it's funny, actually. So I'll try to share it. But there are people like rowing in the other direction. Somebody's patching a hole in the boat. Somebody's trying to blow wind into the sails, and they're all playing different roles. It's great. I'll post it somewhere. When I find it. All right.
Yeah.
So,
I wanted to just reference to that. The quote from Abraham Lincoln about surrounding yourselves. You may be surrounded by people who don't agree in this boat, but the response is not to organize or have authority or be disgusted by it, but to listen, to make your fellow boat travelers feel heard.
Yeah, I think that's part of the magic of what we're doing as a community here. All these people, currently almost 800 listening. I think we're all in this boat together, and we're all trying to build that practice in ourselves, in our own personal lives, but also bring that into the work life, because fundamentally it's a human experience that we're living together, whether we're building a product or working in social services or working in government or education or whatever it is, that domain, we're still doing it with and for people. No matter how much machine intelligence we have, we're still interacting together. It's beautiful.
And we hope to do it for the Earth too.
Oh yeah, for the Earth, yeah. So I just have a shout out to my fellow Los Altan over there. Wherever you go in the world, there's Los Altos, and anybody who's from Los Altos, California, will understand exactly what I'm talking about. You can't escape Los Altos; it follows you.
No, you can't.
So there you are. Thanks, and thanks, Brian. It's great. I really appreciate all the help you've given to make this conference come to life, and I really appreciate it. All the effort you've done.
You are welcome, sir. You are welcome.
So.
Great.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Last words. We've come to the top of the hour, but
we're good. I think time is your friend is my favorite.
Yeah, well, we're in Switzerland, so we're supposed to respect the trains run on time. We're supposed to.
Yeah, you're all about time.
Yeah.
You're doing a good job, sir.
Very good. So you can sign off, and we'll talk later.
Thank you very much, everybody.
We'll talk later.
Bye.
All right.
Bye. Thank you, Indi. Thank you, Jesse.